Come on guys, you know why we're here. I'm Tony Fuentes and today we're editing the style behind Pau Clavero. Now Pau Clavero is a Spanish photographer and YouTuber quite famous for his travel videos, but as well for his Instagram feed. Now his Instagram feed is quite unique. You can see a lot of flat tones, moody tones. It kind of reminds me of Garrett King's in that sense, that it's quite flat, but it has a retro twist to it. You see, he's quite a fan of the analog photography, so he tries to incorporate all those aspects from that style, from that look, into the digital photography. And it's quite unique. We can see a lot of pastel tones, some film grain, and a lot of lifted shadows. So let's get into it, guys. So guys, this is Pau Clavero on Instagram. Hi Clavero is his Instagram handle. If you want to go and support him, go ahead. And just a little disclaimer, I'm not claiming that I can reproduce his style 100%. If you want to do that, go and check out his presets. There you can get his style pure, 100% done by him. So let's get into it. So if we scroll down, the first thing that we can see is that his style is mainly based around portraits. So there's portraits from head-ins, from shoulders up, from 3/4 for complete landscape photography with a subject in the middle. And the tones are very analog. We can see basically in this image is the most analog thing that you can see. And this first image, we can see the pastel tones in the sky, in the grass, everything is desaturated. And even though it's shot at harsh sunlight, he's managed to make it a lot more flat. So we don't realize that it's a very harsh sunlight. We don't see pure whites. Pure whites like in the bottom here in Instagram aren't in the image, or pure blacks. We don't see any pure blacks either. Now if you zoom in, we can see the grain, and the fill grain is very rough and very big, referencing the analog photography. We can see it up here in the highlights as well as in the shadows. Now we all know these mills. This is the windmills in Castilla on La Mancha. It's beautiful. Now a thing that we can notice as a constant in all his photography is that the blacks are very lifted. We can see a lot of grays. We don't see pure blacks nor pure whites either way. But in this case, we lose a lot of information in the dark areas of the image. That's referencing the analog photography where the dynamic range is quite limited. And in this case, these portraits are beautiful. We can see they transmit a lot of energy, a lot of blues, that it's a cold night, it's a cold day. And we can see the blues in the shadows, and the shadows are very lifted. So this is a beautiful set of photographies. Now at the start of this video, I did say that Garrett King's style is quite similar to this one, basically because it's very flat. But in this case, we don't see beaming sunsets, beaming lights, reflections everywhere like Garrett King. Instead, we see a lot of moody tones, a lot of tones without harsh sunlight. Now, different to Garrett King, he shoots at blue hour nor at golden hour, so there's no beaming sunlight. And instead, we don't see any shadows around Pau himself. Now, this photograph is fantastic with a lot of pastel colors. And again, if we zoom in, the blacks are lifted and they have a blue tint to it. That is done in the RGB tone curve and in the blue tone curve. So let's go ahead and continue analyzing his style. These photographs are fantastic as well. Now in this case, this landscape photography is a prime example of the flatness in his profile. We can see the harsh sunlight. If we zoom in, there's the shadow of the subject, but we don't realize it if we don't punch in. That means that this image is quite flat looking. There's no pure whites, there's no pure blacks. There's just lifted shadows and dimmed down highlights and blues in the midtones and the shadows. So we keep going down. Now here we can find an anomaly to his style, in the sense that he uses a lot of clarity and texture to highlight the hands of the subject. Normally he doesn't use a lot of clarity. We can see it in all these images where the images are quite flat and they don't have a lot of texture or clarity punched in. But in this case, he chose to use a lot of clarity, so the hands stand out a lot more. So he's a very skilled editor. Now these photographs of Peru are the prime example of his style applied to portraits. So it's a perfect style for portraits, and we can see the dimmed shadows with a lot of blues in them. So that's the perfect style that we want to replicate. Again, we go down and we can see that he's pretty famous in portraits, and in this case this is the cast from Elite, the Netflix original series. And again, the blacks aren't pure blacks, they're basically grays with a lot of film grain in them. The greens are quite warm, and as well we can see the same style but in black and white, with the blacks raised and no harsh sunlight. And lastly but not least, we can see this image that it's apparent that it's a very warm place. It's in the Philippines. We can see the palm trees and the way the woman is dressed. But again, we can see a lot of blues in the shadows and in the midtones, and the greens are quite desaturated. So let's go ahead and replicate his style, guys. So once we open up Lightroom, we can see all our images. In this case, in blue, we have the image that we're going to use as a reference to achieve the color grading of Pau Clavero. And the photos I've chosen are several portraits of Danny and some random people in the streets of Tokyo. So let's start off by creating a beta preset. Then we're going to apply it to another image with different lighting settings, so we can adapt the preset to be adaptive to all kinds of photography. So in this case, let's start off with this one of Danny and the beach at blue hour. And let's compare it to this other of this Peruvian at blue hour as well. With C on our keyboard, we can select them and see the comparison. And yeah, this is what we want to achieve: the lifted shadows, the blues in the shadows and the midtones and the blacks, but not in the highlight. So let's go and edit this, guys. Now this image is underexposed, so I'm just gonna amp up the exposure just a little bit so we can edit a bit better. Now, as we know, presets are rarely a one-click edit. Normally you have to adjust some settings to match the lighting conditions of the exposure and the white balance of the situation in which the original preset was created in. So in this case, this preset temperature or white balance in general, exposure and contrast will depend on each image. So let's start off by making the image a lot more flat towards his style. Let's decrease the highlight to a -60, amp up the shadows to a +45. The whites control the brightest parts of our image, so I'm just going to pull them down to a -30, and the blacks I'm just going to return them with a -12. Now texture, clarity and dehaze, we're not going to move them. Clavero basically doesn't use them except in some rare cases. So we're just going to leave them at 0 and we're going to edit them depending on the photograph. Now vibrance and saturation, we're just going to decrease them both to a -10. And the key to this edit is going to be the tone curve and the channels. So in this case, I'm just going to start off with the RGB and create 3 points. One in the middle, one in the highlights and one in the shadows, just around here. And the first thing I'm going to do is decrease the highlights by creating another point over here and dragging this ultimate point all the way down. And then this way the pure whites won't appear on our image and are going to be just a little bit dimmed down. Now what we want, if we see the comparison once again, is the faded shadow. So for that, what we're going to do is move this last point up. And as we can see, the blacks are turning into grays. Not too much, I'm just going to leave it around there. Maybe add another point in the midtones and drag them down, more like so, and I'm quite happy with that. Next up, we're going to add the tint to the bluish tones and the greenish in the shadows and in the midtones. And the bluish tones, we don't want it to affect the higher end of our images. We can see, if we look at this image for example, most of the midtones, the shadows and the blacks are bluish. But if we look at this other example, we can see that the highlights aren't affected and the whites by this bluish tint. In order to achieve that, what we're going to do, we'll just jump back to the image, is create 3 anchor points. One over here in the middle, one over here, and over here once again. We're going to move this last point up, and as we can see, the blacks acquire these bluish tones. Not too much, we're going to move it just around there, and these mid-tones, we're going to move them up a little bit as well. Now these other points, what just allowed is that this curve doesn't affect the highlights and the whites in particular. Next up, we're going to do the same thing with the greens, create 3 points, or 3 anchors in general. So this part is completely stretched out, and we're just going to move up the blacks just a little bit up and the shadows. Not too much, otherwise our image will turn too green. Now if we click on this button, we can see what we've done with the tone curves, and I'm quite happy with it. Next up, HSL, we're going to skip it and we're going to apply it in the next image, because this image in particular only has blues, aquas and the orange in the skin tone. It doesn't have all the other colors that we want to edit. So we're going to edit that in the second image. We're going to skip all the way down to split toning, and here we're going to add a color around the 50 or the 49. In this case, it's going to be an orangey color in the highlights and with just a 7 saturation. Now the shadows is going to go with a 230, and this is a blue color only to reinforce what we've already done. So we're going to add it with a 12%. And the final thing that we want to achieve is the film grain. Now if we look at his editing style, we can see there's a lot of roughness in the film grain. So we're going to achieve that by applying an amount of 25. Now let's zoom in just a little bit to make sure that we can see it. 25, the size is going to go up to a 73 or 73-ish, and the roughness is just going to go down to a 42, just around there. And now we can see that the film grain is very present. It's not too distracting, but it still gives us that film look style. Okay, so this preset, or the beta preset, is complete. So we're going to go up to here and select create preset. Now we're going to name it Clavero, and remember, white balance, exposure and contrast, we're going to uncheck them because that will depend on each image. So we're going to create it. So let's move on to the next image and see how it applies. So the next image is another portrait of Danny going down a stairway. We're going to go to the develop tab. Let's apply the preset and see how it performs. And there it goes. We can see the bluish tones in the shadows and in the blacks. It's looking quite well. The only thing here is the oranges, the yellows and the greens aren't performing as we want. Now if we see this image once again, the greens are more towards the orangey yellowish tones rather than to the emeralds like this one. So let's edit this. For that, now we're going to go to the HSL. And in HSL, the first thing that we're going to do in hue is move the greens. You see, if we go to the right, they turn towards the emerald coldish vibes. We want it to go all the way down to the other side, maybe 60%, and now they're a bit more orangey. Now the aquas are going to go towards the blues, and the blues are going to go towards the aquas. Now that's just to achieve the filmic look colors when there's a bluish background or a bluish sky. Now the oranges, I'm not going to move too much because that affects the skin tones. Instead, I'm going to move the yellows all the way to the 60s or around there. That's more acquaint to the styles that we want. We don't want it towards the greenish. Next up, saturation. And now in saturation, we're just going to desaturate the greens, the aquas and the blues so they're a bit less harsh. Now in order to do that, we can do it by moving the sliders, introducing the number or the value right here, or we can click on the name, and with plus and negative on our keyboard, we can move the factors by 5%. So I'm going to click on aqua and hit twice negative, click blue, hit 3 times negative to get a -15. Okay, so next up, luminance. Now in luminance, in order to achieve those pastel-like colors that the film look gives us, we're gonna just illuminate every single color to a +20. Once we finish with that, the preset is complete. And in this image in particular, I'm just gonna move down the exposure just a little bit over here. And yeah, it looks pretty much like Clavero style. Now let's go down over here, put the cursor over Clavero, right click and update with current settings. Update, and now the preset is complete. Now let's see how it applies and how to correct it in each of the images that I've selected. So next up, this image of a sunset at golden hour in Japan, 2 people in the stairway, and here we can see how the preset performs in harsh sunlight. We can see the beams of the sun, and as well we can see the white of the jacket and the backpack of this traveler. So in this case, let's apply the preset, and yeah, here it goes. All those bluish tones that we were looking for, we can compare it to this one, and it's quite similar. I'm pretty happy with the results with just one click in this image. Next up, we have another image in Japan. This is in Shibuya Crossing, and if we apply the preset, this image is going to turn a lot blue. So let's apply the preset, and yes, the image is pretty blue. That's basically because here in the tone curves, the blues are affecting basically the shadows and the blacks. Now this image is underexposed, so everything that is black and underexposed is going to turn to the bluish. How do we correct this? It's simple. Just move the exposure up, expose the image correctly, and as we can see, as we move the slider up, the whites and the highlights start losing that bluish tint to it. Just around there, I'm quite happy with that. We can see the before and after. And yeah, the effect is there. It's pretty nice actually. Maybe adds a little bit more contrast to this image. And I'm quite happy with that. Okay, let's do 2 more. In this case, another underexposed portrait of Danny. Let's apply the preset. Yeah, and it's pretty blue. So in this case, let's move up the exposure to a point where I'm comfortable with. And as we move up the exposure, we can see that the highlights are a bit too pointy. So we're gonna just decrease the whites and decrease the highlights just a little bit so it's a bit more flat, the image. And now what we can see is that the image is a bit too cold in my taste to the situation. We can see that she's in a bathing suit, so it should be a very warmish day. So in this case, I'm just gonna move the temperature up. And around there, I'm quite happy with that. Now it's a bit warmish, the tones, but we still conserve all those bluish hints in the shadows and in the blacks. So I'm quite happy with that. Now some portraits that he takes, for example this one, we don't see that bluish tone in the shadows. Now in order to achieve that, what we can do is simply go down to the tone curve and move this last point all the way down, and yeah, or double click the others, and basically we delete what we did in the tone curve at the blue RGB, and there we have that faded look without the bluish tones. And the final image that we have is this cook in a Japanese restaurant. So let's apply the Clavero preset. Again, this image is quite underexposed. I like to shoot moody dark photography. So in this case, let's move up the exposure up. And now we can see that the blues have moved away and the image is a lot more compensated. Now when I see a kitchen or a restaurant, we can see people hurrying, all the fire, and I'm very rushed to get the orders out. So I'm just gonna move the temperature up just a little bit and move the contrast up as well. And I'm quite happy with the results, guys. I think we've achieved the objective of replicating Pau Clavero style. What do you think? Put in the comments down below if I've achieved it, if you would change anything else. But I am quite happy with the results and with the effect that this preset applies to portraits in general. And that's it for this tutorial, guys. As always, I've added Pau Clavero's preset into the Edit Like preset pack on my shop, so go check it out. There's the preset pack with the styles from Alan Palander, Garrett King, all those famous people that we've analyzed in the tutorials, so go check it out. And if you did like the video, can you please give it a like? It really makes a difference, and consider subscribing. Hit the notification bell to be notified when I upload the next video. I'm Tony Fuentes. Cheers to all of you, and see you in the next one.